Welcome to Cincy Reformed Podcast. I'm Pastor Brandon, and I'm joined today with Drew Admiraal. Drew is a seminary student at Westminster, California, and he's going to be joining for a podcast talking about seminary and seminary life. But before we start asking him questions about seminary and all of these things, I thought I would read a quote from B.B. Warfield. B.B. Warfield had a great little pamphlet that he wrote called A Religious Life of a Theological Student. And so in this book, he is talking about the life of devotion, the life of piety and faith and love and all of these things while you're in a unique setting, because seminary is a kind of unique setting. You're spending all day focusing on Christ, focusing on Scripture, focusing on theology, and you're going to chapel and you're hearing great lectures and you're being filled to a degree that you probably have never been filled before. And so he wrote a great book about devotion during seminary life. Here's one of the quotes that he says: "I am asked to speak to you on the religious life of the student of theology. I approach the subject with some trepidation. I think it is the most important subject which can engage our thought. You will not suspect me in saying this to be depreciating the importance of the intellectual preparation of the student for the ministry. The importance of the intellectual preparation of the student for the ministry is the reason of the existence of our theological seminaries. Say what you will, do what you will, the ministry is a learned profession. And the man without learning, no matter with what other gifts he may be endowed, is unfit for its duties. But learning, though indispensable, is not the most indispensable thing for the minister. Apt to teach, yes. The ministry must be apt to teach. And observe that what I say, or rather what Paul says, is apt to teach. Not apt merely to exhort, to beseech, to appeal, to entreat, nor even merely to testify, to bear witness, but to teach. And teaching implies knowledge. He who teaches must know. Paul, in other words, requires of you, as we are perhaps learning not very felicitously, to phrase it instructional, not merely inspirational service. But aptness to teach alone does not make a minister, nor is it his primary qualification. It is only one of a long list of requirements which Paul lays down as necessary to meet in him who aspires to this high office. And all the rest concern not his intellectual, but his spiritual fitness. A minister must be learned on pain of being utterly incompetent for his work. But before and above being learned, a minister must be godly. Nothing could be more fatal, however, than to set these two things over against one another. And so in today's podcast, what we want to talk about is seminary or cemetery. Now, there's been this, people have spoken in a very derogatory manner about seminary, and they'll say things like, well, it's cemetery, it kills the faith. You know, people go there zealous, people go there loving Christ, and then they study theology, and then they leave the faith, and they are just cold the rest of their life. And some people speak about seminary like it's this dying ground or something like that. What do you think about that, Drew? I mean, how should people understand that? How have people understood that throughout history? Why is seminary so important, and why is seminary not necessarily cemetery?
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. So I think, first of all, where we can start is thinking about, in the history of the church, there have always been those who have wanted to set against each other, create a false dichotomy between the ideas of theory and practice. We think of theory as those things that we learn, as the knowledge that we gain, and practice as how we use that theory to then apply it to the ministry. So we're talking specifically here about the ministry. And in the church, there's always been a tendency on the part of some groups to set one over against the other. So I'll just give some examples. The tendency, I think, has always been there, but particularly strong perhaps in the period leading up to the Enlightenment and throughout the Enlightenment into our day as well. A few examples here of how this has played out. One group, the Arminians, some of you may be familiar with them. They were the primary group, also known as the Remonstrants, that were being that the Synod of Dort sought to address their teaching. And Arminius, he was the one for whom Arminianism was named. He said, "The proximate and immediate object of theology is not God himself, but the duty and act of man which he is bound to perform to God." In other words, making theology the object of our theology, not God, but morality, how we live. So setting the practice over against the theory, the things that we learn. Pietism, a movement largely characterized by a turn inward, a desire for inward enlightenment over against and a subjective experience of the divine over against the objective acts of redemptive acts of Christ in history as they are described in Scripture. One of the most well-known pietists and one who's often called the father of modern theology, Schleiermacher, says religion's essence is neither thinking nor acting, but intuition and feeling. It wishes to intuit the universe. So where Arminius made the substance of our theology morality, Schleiermacher wants to make it feeling. How do we feel? Not the thing, not what do we know, but what do we feel? Michael Horton, then, one more piece here that we'll look at. Michael Horton describes modern evangelicalism in this way. Today it is taken for granted by many that those most concerned about doctrine are least interested in reaching the lost, or, as they are now called, the unchurched. So what he's getting at there is people who are really interested in knowledge, there's this stigma around them by many in the church that they're not interested in evangelism, that they're not interested in devotion or piety. And he goes on to say, we're frequently challenged to choose between being traditional or missional, usually with little definition offered for either. Where the earlier evangelical consensus coalesced simultaneously around getting the gospel right and getting it out, increasingly today, the coalition is defined by its style, contemporary versus traditional. Its politics, compassionate conservatism, or the more recent discovery of revivalism's progressivist roots, and its rock star leaders, than for its convictions about God, humanity, sin, salvation, the purpose of history, and the last judgment. The point he's kind of making here is that there used to not be so much of this divide that we find now between the doctrines that we teach, what we know and what we learn from Scripture, and the way that then plays out in our lives and in our churches. But there has become more and more, and we've seen, as I've kind of gone over this in the past couple of minutes here, a trajectory toward where now, if you care about doctrine, if you care about learning, if you care about being an intellectual and learned Christian, a learned minister, as Warfield talks about, there is this sense around that in many quarters that is somehow antithetical to being pious, antithetical to having a passion for the Christian faith, if you care about doctrine. And so I'll read one last quote here from an important and well-known Reformed theologian, Francis Turretin, who rejects this dichotomy that's made between theory and practice. He says, theology is mixed. That is, it's partly theoretical and partly practical. Neither can that knowledge of God be true unless attended by practice. So unless we live out those things, unless our doctrine affects the way that we live, then it's not true knowledge of God. But practice cannot be right and saving, which is not directed by knowledge. So we can't have a proper practice. We cannot worship God properly. We cannot have proper devotion and piety unless we confess rightly those things which Scripture confesses.
Yeah, that's helpful, I think. And so, obviously, there's dangers that people can fall into by overemphasizing one or the other, just focusing on the practice of things and then just not caring about the knowledge of it, or just focusing on the knowledge. But I like what Turgeon says, how it's a mix. They have to come together, and that's really echoing also what Warfield said in that quote about how we cannot separate those things out from the godliness and the growing in knowledge and the piety and the living it out. Seminary has been, or the idea of a theological education is really embedded in scriptures. It's something that has manifested throughout the history of the church. So, for example, in the Bible we see in Titus 1:9, for example, where Paul says that you must be able to, talking about the pastor, you must be able to exhort in sound doctrine and refute those who contradict it. Well, that requires that a pastor must know sound doctrine. It requires that a pastor must know sound doctrine so well that he can detect when people are breaking away from it, when they're contradicting sound doctrine. And of course, it requires a certain level of education, because sometimes what contradicts sound doctrine is only subtle. Sometimes, and as you study heresies in the early church, some of them on the surface of it sounded vaguely okay, but then as you kind of get it down into it, you realize that they are really deviating. But it requires somebody trained in sound doctrine to be able to navigate those waters. We also see, for example, in 2 Timothy 1:14, for example, it says to guard the deposit. And just a verse before that, in 2 Timothy 1:13, it says that we should hold fast to the pattern of sound words. So there is certain theological requirements for a pastor to hold to the pattern of sound words, to guard the deposit, to be able to exhort in sound doctrine, refute those who contradict it. The Apostle Paul in Acts 19, 8-10, taught for 2 years at the hall of Tyrannus. 1 Timothy 4, 11-16, there's the command to teach, to be immersed in these things. Ephesians 4, 11-14, teachers and pastors are to do the work of the ministry, to equip the saints, and so on and so forth. And again, there was a lot of heresies, not only after the apostles, but even during their lifetime. Like, they are interacting with Judaizers. They're interacting with people who are saying, yes, believe in Jesus and have faith and follow Christ, but also keep the laws of Moses. And so they were mixing these things, and the pastors and elders had to very wisely and very appropriately articulate the balance between faith and works, had to very well articulate the differences between the New Covenant and the Mosaic Covenant, or the Old Covenant, and that requires theological education. We see, even early on, we see Jesus discipling people. Make disciples, and he models what disciple making is. In Matthew 28, make disciples by going, by baptizing, and then by teaching them everything, teaching them the whole counsel of God. Jesus said, teach them everything I've commanded you. Teach them Genesis to Revelation. Discipleship making is not a go out and hand a tract out, but it is forming somebody, not just giving them knowledge, but giving them knowledge and forming them practically. And we see that throughout Scripture, and how Jesus was acting and interacting with his disciples, and then how later the disciples and apostles shepherded, as Paul shepherded Timothy and poured into Timothy, that also worked out into the early church, as many of the church fathers studied under some of the apostles. For example, the church father Polycarp studied under the apostle John and received from him and was formed and trained by him. And just throughout the history of the church, through Justin Martyr and some others who were trained in the more philosophical arena, coming into some of the catechetical schools in Alexandria, and how they had schools that were designed to shape, to form people in almost like an apprenticeship kind of way, where you're not only receiving knowledge being passed down to you, but you're also being formed in life and piety. You see monasteries and monastic schools eventually take over a lot of the theological education. If you wanted to receive education in Scripture and theology, you would go to a monastery to receive that kind of instruction. Later on, that was handed over to the universities. So even up into our modern period, we have universities like Yale and Harvard today. And Princeton. Yale, Harvard, and Princeton were schools that were the place that you would go to receive theological education. Sadly, I wouldn't go there for theological education today. In some of those schools, you can actually get a theological education without ever reading the Bible, because they've kind of drifted so far. And so many seminaries now are the places where you send people who want to be pastors, and they receive theological instruction and theological education. And again, heresies are tricky, and they've always been tricky, because heretics are not typically the people who say, I reject the Bible. Heretics are usually the people who say, I just believe the Bible, and I'm just following the Bible. For example, Arianism was the idea that Jesus was the highest created being, but he was not God. He was the firstborn of creation, but he was not God. And so kind of rejecting that. And again, when you talk to Arius about it, he wanted to argue biblical texts, and he would say, well, it says here in Colossians, firstborn of creation, and he wanted to argue very biblically what he was trying to articulate. It's heresy, but so Arius is not saying, I just reject Scripture. He's saying, no, I'm just following the Bible. Well, that's a trickier thing for pastors and elders to navigate when someone says, I'm just following the Bible. And it requires theological education to be able to pick up on deviations from sound doctrine. Earlier on in Scripture, as the canon of the Bible was closing, as the apostles were beginning to die off and hand kind of pass the baton, as it were, to some of the elders and pastors that they raised up in other congregations. Gnosticism was really starting to get traction in the 2nd century especially, and the Gnostics mixed a lot of Greek philosophy with the Bible, and they wrote these other gospels, like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter. And in these other Gnostic writings, it's just not Christianity. They're using a lot of the Christian language and the Christian lingo, but it's very much Greek philosophy, packaged in scriptural terms. And it gets very weird sometimes. For example, the Gospel of Thomas, that says that Mary had to make herself a man in order to go to heaven, because only men go to heaven. Had a very low view of women. The Gnostics had this idea that secret knowledge saved you, that you had to attain to a secret spiritual plane. The Gnostics had an idea that physical things, matter, was evil, and only the spiritual was the good. And again, just turning Christianity on its head. It wasn't Christian at all. And again, it takes somebody who knows sound doctrine, who is holding to the pattern of sound words. And as Paul says over and over again, hold fast to the traditions that I've taught you. the patterns that I've taught you, the doctrine that I've taught you. And it just presupposes that there is an educated ministers who have studied, who have thought about this, who have been trained, and who are equipped to detect deviations in something that is biblical. When somebody deviates, even if it's just slightly, even if it's just interacting with kind of mixing philosophy with the Bible or something, we need our pastors to be equipped to do this. So, Drew, as we kind of think through this some more, what is your thoughts? What are some of your concluding thoughts about how do we keep devotion and doctrine together, piety, practice, and also growing in our knowledge and our understanding, holding fast to the pattern of sound words? How do we keep those together? How do we keep those from getting unbalanced? And how do we do seminary without it becoming cemetery?
Yeah, I think it is a real danger that we face in seminaries. There's a reason why people say that it's cemetery, because there is a real danger there, and it has happened to many people that they go into seminary and they do lose their devotion and piety. They lose their passion for the faith, and so there is a real danger there. But I think it's really important, as you've been talking about, that we keep this emphasis that the church has had from the beginning, and that the apostles handed down to the church, on a learned ministry, that we keep our emphasis on a rigorous education for our ministers, but that we also are very careful that we don't create a space where it is easy for students to lose their devotion and piety either. We want to keep the two tied together. This is always the balance that we want to strike, as we began with Warfield at the beginning. And so I think there's things we can do on the seminary side. There's things we can do from the student's perspective, and then there's things that the church should also be doing to assist with this. On the seminary side, you mentioned earlier, the offering chapels, offering prayer groups for the students. These are important ways that we can remember the ultimate goal of seminary, which is that we might go on to serve Christ in His church in some way, shape, or form afterward. And chapels and prayer groups allow us those times when we can be reminded of that. I think it's helpful. Oftentimes, seminaries will have a lot of their professors who are also ordained ministers, and so they're able then to connect for students in class, not only on the intellectual side and to help them to learn the material that's necessary, but also to connect for them how this ultimately will play out in their ministry after seminary. So to help them to connect the two, because they themselves are pastors and they understand, they have personal experience with how the two are connected. Seminaries also, I am convinced, should be placing a high emphasis on encouraging internships with churches, because without a seminary can only do so much, and I will talk about that as well when we talk about what can a church do, but a seminary is not the same thing as a church, even though it can in many ways prepare for, even though it is intended, of course, to prepare for the ministry and can in many ways foster devotion and piety in its students. It's not the same, and so it's important that students have experience while they're in seminary with what they'll be doing when they get out of seminary. So especially if a student is planning on going into ordained ministry after seminary, it's really important for that student to be connected to a church that and do an internship with that church, so that they can have the kind of experiences that a seminary simply cannot give them. On the church's side, right, we recognize that, of course, a seminary and church are not the same. They should be functioning together and should be mutually beneficial to one another, but they're not the same. And so the church needs to recognize that these dangers do exist for seminary students. It needs to seek to support them by giving them internships, by making sure that they have the pastoral care that they need in the church. And then lastly, on the student side, it's important that the student recognizes that the seminary is not the church. It can only do so much. It's not primarily responsible for your devotion and piety. You need to connect yourself with a local church, and that is perhaps the most important thing a student can do to not make seminary into cemetery, is to be connected and involved in their local church. And it's also important that a student work on their own spiritual disciplines while they're in seminary, not neglect those things. Even if a student spends all day in seminary in classes that are talking about scripture and church history and all of these subjects, it's important that a student still has their own time where they're reading scripture, where they're meditating on scripture, and where they are intentionally seeking to integrate theory and practice.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, Drew. As I reflect on my seminary time, when I was looking at seminaries and I was applying for different seminaries, I remember asking Westminster in Pennsylvania, what do you guys have in terms of student life on campus? And they said, not much, because we want you in the local church. We don't want to create some kind of middle ground environment where it might try to, tempt you away from the local church, but we want you embedded, serving in the church. And I thought that was really helpful in terms of really wanting people to be embedded and serving in a local church context. And that was so helpful for me in seminary. I was teaching the youth, and so it was so helpful as I was learning these great things, but also interacting with a youth culture as I was serving the youth and teaching them. And it was just a helpful balance of doctrine and life, and seeing how it fleshes out in a local church setting. Also, prayer time. I think that a lot of times seminary becomes cemetery when you lose prayer. When prayer is just a forgotten thing, when prayer is, you go days without praying or something because you're reading Bavinck or whatever, and that should not be. So guarding a prayer life, we had prayer groups where a professor had a certain amount of people, and we would meet with that professor and we would share prayer concerns. The professor was open and giving prayer concerns that they had. We were giving prayer concerns that we had, praying for one another, emailing each other, and that was a vital time. Also, like you said, chapels. I just loved going into chapels, seeing the professor just worshiping and engaged in the Word, where it wasn't just a theory, it wasn't just in our heads, but it was something that manifested in our hearts and in our lives. And of course, head, heart, and hands are all connected, but seminary is a time where your head is going to get bigger faster than the rest. And I had one professor, he said, when you leave here, your head is going to be this kind of massive thing because you just spent hours and hours and hours reading Turretin and Voss and Bavinck and all of these great theologians, and it's going to take some time to kind of filter down into heart, into belief, into hands, into life as you serve the church. And so just kind of being aware of what seminary is. I mean, seminary is a time of really rigorous, intense theological education that is a little bit not typical on your ordinary life. And so just realizing you're going into a season of intense study, not going to overlook prayer time or serving the church or anything like that, but you are entering a unique season in life to prepare for ministry. I loved that whole balance that you gave, Drew. Well, we are Cincy Reformed Podcast. This is a production of Westside Reformed Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. You can visit us at cincyreformed.org or our church, westsidereform.org.